So, this story is about my dad's ex-girlfriend. My dad has had horrible luck with women. He's like a crazy magnet. Every woman he has ever dated, except for his current girlfriend, have been abusive both mentally and physically. The list includes my mother, too. But this story is about his last girlfriend, Mary. She's gone from stalking not only him, but me, my husband, and our daughter, too. They met at a Christmas party and hit it off. He had just gotten out of another bad relationship with a different woman that had been on and off with him for 3 years. She was the classic narcissistic type. Well, Mary seemed different. She claimed she was also just out of an abusive relationship. They went out for a few months, but she never let my dad to her place. He didn't find it all that weird until he received a call from a man who said he was her wife and wanted to know how my dad knew her. At first, my dad thought the guy was some jealous ex still trying to control her, but things started to add up. He finally confronted Mary and she gave him some sob story about how her ex was refusing to sign the papers, but they were separated. Dad did a bit of digging and even talked to Mary's parents at one point. He found out that not only was Mary definitely still married, but she wasn't even separated from her husband. As far as everyone in her life knew, she was happily married and my dad was just a friend, if they knew about him at all. Needless to say, he broke up with her. She lost it. She started showing up at his work, calling in the middle of the night, texting him 50 times a day, all that good stuff. My dad moved states twice and changed his number several times to try and get away from her, but she always seemed to find him. Love letters would arrive in the mail, or she would call and say she was coming to see him. Then she found my phone number. Probably sometime after my dad moved in with me. She started texting me almost as much as him. Once I married my husband and had my daughter, she really went all out. She started sending presents for her new granddaughter, always wanting updates on the life. I never replied and either sent back the unopened packages or donated the items he had sent to me. Everything finally came to a head when she arrived on my dad's doorstep while he was at work with a casserole for him. She gave it to his roommate and told him it was because she had noticed my dad was losing weight. He told his roommate to toss it. He didn't want to risk poison since he had just applied for a restraining order. That same night, she showed up at my apartment while my husband worked the overnight shift. It was after 1 a.m. when she started knocking on my door. I was glad that I had sent my toddler to my aunt and uncle's for the night when I saw it was her. She left banana bread on my doorstep that we threw out as soon as my husband got home. The next night, I again left my toddler with my aunt and uncle in case she came back. Well, she did. I started getting texts from her as she pounded on my door. She wanted to see her grandbaby and have some girl time with me. They slowly devolved into demands for me to open up the door. I called the cops. While I was on the phone with dispatch, my neighbor came out ready to take her on. He told her cops were on the way, since his wife was already calling them as well. She disappeared pretty quickly into the park across the street. The cops didn't catch her, but my dad's restraining order did get granted. We have since moved across the state, but she still texts me from time to time wanting to know how my dad is or what my daughter is up to. I never answer, but I do save all her texts just in case I need to get my own restraining order as well. This happened to me when I was about 9 years old, in primary school. I'm currently a 22-year-old male from the UK and have unfortunately had a history of attracting creeps. I lived in quite a small upper-class village in a rural area of the UK, around 5,000 residents in total. Both my parents worked extremely high-stress, high-demand jobs. My mother was a lecturer of psychology and my father was a lawyer, so as usual, I'd walk home, which always seemed fairly safe as everyone seemed to know everyone, and the walk to the gated community where I lived wasn't too far from the school. It was the last day of school before the summer holidays, and I was excited to get home, play with some Legos, watch some Power Rangers, and maybe even play some Nintendo. Life was good, and in my mind, nothing could go wrong. Of course, I was very badly mistaken. Less than 200 yards away from the walls of the community I lived in, I noticed a woman, dirty looking, crouching down behind some bushes in front of a large wooded area my parents told me was a strict no-go area. Slowing my stride down to almost a shuffle, she waves me over, and everything inside of me is telling me to ignore her, to run home. Stranger danger warnings play through my head, but 9-year-old me was intrigued as to why a woman would be hiding in a bush, so reluctantly I moved towards her. On closer inspection, she's bloody, around 22, and even as a child I could tell she was a few sandwiches short of a picnic. I'm about 10 feet away from her when I notice she's holding something close to her breast, swallowed in a blanket. "Do you know what noise a baby makes?" she asked, almost whispering. I'm genuinely confused and getting more scared by the moment, and so don't answer her when she starts cursing and making extremely odd facial expressions, her face contorting in the noon sun. "I need a baby," she says again, clutching the swaddled lump closer to her, digging her nails in. Now I'm noticing the smell, the stench of rotting meat and decay. She's still talking, and I manage to see the glistening mess of afterbirth strewn across the grass when she turns the blanket to face me, exposing the blue face of a baby. I ran, almost in a panic attack, confused and frightened. From behind me she's screaming, though it doesn't sound human, and I'm tearing up when I see my father pull into the street. I run to his car and he gets out, first laughing, then, upon seeing my face, drops, and I cry. He holds me close and eventually gets what happened out of me. I was grounded for the summer for my own protection, and the police were notified. I was no longer able to walk to and from school now. It only dawned on me much later in life what I saw. It was most likely a miscarriage. Although it was terrifying, I can't help but feel sorry for that girl. She needed help, and I hope she found what she needed. When I was 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform and hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter and getting cold and darker, and it was just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and some food to eat, when an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such for a train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be long until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night, and offered him a meal in a room at her house, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and Great-Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, it was more like 2, and by the time they had arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled at the realization that this old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry and really too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, then said goodnight, and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called to her, but she didn't answer and he heard nothing else. Figuring he would deal with it in the morning and that she probably had done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and to try and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to pee and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something that he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees and began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that's where the pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. "Nope," was Great Uncle John's response, and he went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in that room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to go out that way, there was a good chance that this old woman and whoever else might be in this house would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing that he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with a blanket. Then he got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs and then towards the room. The lock clicked and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move towards the bed. Then he heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence, then a person went out of the room and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs and there was silence again. John moved out from under the bed, then took the crowbar and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw the suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury and began to run into a field behind the house towards some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks on it, and John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what happened to the authorities, since at the time in the USSR there was a distinct chance that he would have been the one that got in trouble. He just thanked God he escaped and decided that next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take another way. This happened 6 years ago. At the time, I was 17 years old, and I'm a male. I lived in the biggest city of Switzerland, which is probably the safest country in the world, but still, things like this have happened. So, it was a Saturday night, and a friend of mine turned 16 that day. He decided to celebrate his birthday in a well-known bar in the old town of said city. As you may not know, you're allowed to drink alcohol at the age of 16 in Switzerland. So we were having a great time that night, drinking and partying. My friend, whose birthday it was, got heavily drunk in no time because of all the drinks he was offered. So he decided to head home pretty early. Well, around midnight if I remember properly. Me and two of my friends didn't want to call it a night yet, and we went out for a smoke through the back door of the bar. After we finished, we realized we had drunkenly shut ourselves out. So we had to go all the way around the block to enter through the front door again. As we are making our way back to the entrance, more of a staggering than walking, we passed this old shady looking dude. In my drunken state, I bumped into him with my shoulder, but carried on walking anyways. Shortly after, we hear him shouting, "Fucking foreigners!" or something other than that I can't really remember. We, quite puzzled by his sudden rage, just stood in the middle of the walkway trying to rationalize his outburst. I mean, it was just a bump on the shoulder. I didn't even hit him hard, and nor was it intended. As we were standing there, he started speed walking in my direction. I assumed he was just gonna curse us out or something, but I was very wrong. He started throwing fists at me. His punches didn't hit me that hard, and he wasn't even aiming for my face. I took one hard punch to the back side of my ribs though, and that's when one of my friends pushed him away. I collected myself and we gathered in front of him. He was just standing in front of us, shouting that we have no respect of the elders and that he's gonna kill us all. This old man was nuts and probably on drugs or something. As he was frantically shouting at us, we realized there's a knife in his hand. We then booked it out of that situation, back to the bar in hyperspeed, adrenaline pumping through our veins. Because of my drunken state, it suddenly seemed to have cleared up, and I started to feel a pulsating pain at that point where he'd hit me. As I went to touch that spot, it felt wet. I took my hand out from under my shirt and saw blood. Adrenaline rushing again, I hesitated no second and took off my shirt in the middle of the bar. By the reaction of the people around me, I could tell something was wrong. They took me to the toilet where I could see it myself. I had a big wound in the back of my ribs, and it was bleeding, but to my surprise, it wasn't bleeding that heavily. Still, I was in a bit of a panic and didn't know what to do. In fear of the police, we had smoked some weed that night, and I was afraid they could drug test me. I know it's stupid in retrospect. We decided to head for the train station and take the first train home. Half an hour train ride later, I arrived at my parents'. I woke them up by telling them that something had happened, and then I took a knife to the back. They were understandably up in an instant. The only thing my father said after he saw the wound was, "Oh, a band-aid will do just fine." My mother, on the other hand, wasn't having any of this and drove me directly to the hospital where they sounded the depth of my wound. They said that it was very lucky. Had I been stabbed a little more to the right, and he would have punctured my lung, and I probably would have drowned in my own blood. The police then came to the hospital as well, and I had to give them a statement. I told them everything I could remember. I even had to go to the police station again the next day, and I was surprised that they had already had a collage of mugshots prepared. I could identify that old bastard right away, though. Obviously, he was already registered, and they even told me that he stabbed another guy in the same night. Shortly after, we met again in court. I can't remember what he was sentenced to. It doesn't even matter anyways, because karma got to him. After some time passed, 2 or 3 months later, I received a letter explaining the death of my attacker while he was in prison. So yeah, thanks karma for doing your thing. I won't ever have to meet this bastard again. I surf. It's a big part of my life, and if I go a few days without getting in the water, I go through withdrawals. In the last year, my work schedule has changed so that I am working a lot of late evenings, usually getting home around 4 a.m. I live on the beach and have gotten myself into a routine of coming home, grabbing a bowl of cereal, and getting my board and heading to the beach around 4:30. It's still dark at this time, but most nights the moonlight and the glow from the pier is enough to illuminate the waves. I'll usually surf for a couple of hours, catch the sunrise, and then head home for sleep. Most days the beach is empty for the first hour or so, with the exception of the occasional jogger. Monday starts off with the usual routine. I stay pretty close to the pier, but the rip current was strong, and on days like that I just drift with the current until I hit a point about half a mile down from the pier. I use a particular house's light as my marker, then pedal back to the shore and walk back to my starting point. As I was waiting for the next set, I noticed the outline of someone standing on the shore watching me. I couldn't really make out any details, just that there was indeed a person there. I really didn't think twice about it, as it's not that uncommon for people to stop and watch me for a few minutes. I continued surfing and put him out of my mind. Approximately 45 minutes later, the current has pulled me to my marker and I start to paddle into shore. It's then that I notice what I think is the same person from earlier still lingering, which is odd because I've been out there for a while and drifted a far distance. He apparently followed along the whole time on the shore. I reach the shore, throw a quick glance in his direction. He's a husky white male of about 40-ish, wearing some shorts and a ratty-looking 49ers t-shirt from what I can see. He's about 15 feet behind in the shadows. and I start walking briskly back up the beach towards the pier and my beach access ramp. He follows along, always keeping the same distance, even though I speed up and slow down a few times just to see how he reacts. Nothing is said, but it's clear he's following me at this point. I get to the beach access ramp, turn around, and he's gone? He must have ducked behind one of those hotel stairwells. That's all I can think, but I wasn't going to go look for him, and I just chalked it up to one of the local homeless or eccentric people this area has to offer. And I didn't really give it any more thought than that. Fast forward to the next morning. It's overcast and a little darker out. I'm in my routine and I'm back on the beach at about 4:45 a.m. The swells are light and I'm close to the pier, just floating as there is no rip current this day. I start to get that you're being watched feeling and I can't seem to shake it. Looking around, the beach and pier are deserted. Except I notice what looks like a lone fisherman standing above me on the pier. But I can't really make out any of his details as he is backlit and I can only see his outline. I don't notice a pole though, and he just seems to be standing there. I get into a wave as I glance back. It looks like the guy threw something into the water at that moment. I didn't think anything of it until a few minutes later I glanced back and it appeared that he just tossed something else into the water. As soon as I look in his direction, he stops what he's doing and just stands there motionless. So now I'm curious as to what he's up to. The sky is lightening up a bit and the next set of waves roll through. This time, as I start to paddle into the wave, I am watching him over my shoulder. As soon as it looks like my attention is elsewhere, the man tosses in several more objects, yet stops as soon as I'm turned back towards him. It finally dawns on me what he's doing. He's chumming the water by tossing chunks of meat into the sea around me. You chum to attract fish. The bigger pieces you use, the bigger fish you attract, and these were not small. This guy has no fishing gear with him and is attempting to attract sharks right to where I am, in the dark water, maybe 150 yards offshore. I'm overcome with a mixture of fear and anger. I start paddling hard but steadily into shore, and then he drops all pretense and dumps an entire bucket over the side of the pier while starting to walk back towards the shore end. As I get out of the water, I start to move towards the pier stairwell, intent on confronting him. I'm no punk, and this guy just put me into a dangerous situation. He's coming down the pier in my direction as well, and this is when I finally get a decent look at the guy. He appears to be a little heavyset and is wearing a red shirt, a red 49ers shirt, the same guy from the day before. At this moment, a strong feeling comes over me that I need to get out of there instead of escalating this situation further. I am not the toughest guy in the block, but I've had my share of scraps and generally don't shy away from confrontation, but something inside of me felt that this was very, very wrong. I change directions and begin walking towards the beach access ramp and home. He comes down the stairs and continues to follow me at about a 10-foot distance. The only sounds are the waves crashing on the shores as we play out our low-speed pursuit across the sand. I get to the beach ramp and start to go up. Now, this ramp has a 90-degree turn about halfway that leads to a 30 or so yard long walkway between the two condo buildings to access the beach and street. Once I hit the 90-degree turn and I'm out of his immediate line of sight, I book it in double time to the far end of the walkway, putting some distance between us. I'm still going back and forth in my head if I should confront him or follow my gut and walk away. I stop and wait at the far end of the walkway as he turns the corner at the 90-degree bend and just stops. We just stare at each other in silence. After what felt like ages but was probably all of 20 seconds, he reaches into his waistband and draws out what appears to be a fillet knife. I can see its reflection in the light. He waves to me with the other hand, lets out a short but sharp laugh, and quickly spins on his heels, disappearing back down the ramp and out of sight. I decided I had had enough, and Taking a slightly roundabout route to make sure he wasn't tailing me still, I headed home. I haven't seen him since, but I also haven't been back to the beach in a few days. So, to the guy who tried to turn me into shark bait, let's never meet again.